The security officer's hand was already on Marcus Reed's shoulder when he saw his daughter standing at the end of the hallway. Sofia Reed was 12 years old. She was still wearing the navy uniform of the school that had once felt like the safest place in her world. Now she was staring at her father as two security officers escorted him past classrooms filled with students behind them. Principal Richard Coleman held a folder against his chest. $180,000. That was the number everyone was whispering about. Money missing from the school's $4.6 million renovation project. And somehow, the evidence had led them to Marcus, the man who cleaned their classrooms before sunrise, the man who repaired their doors after everyone had gone home, the man who had never once asked anyone at the school for special treatment. Sofia took one step forward. "Dad?" Marcus stopped. For a moment, he looked less like an accused employee and more like a father trying to decide how much truth his daughter was ready to carry. Then he looked at Coleman, then back at Sofia. "Go to class," he said quietly. "I'll explain everything tonight." Sofia's eyes filled with doubt. "Did you do it?" Marcus answered with only 2 words. "No, sweetheart." Then he walked out of the building. But there was one thing Principal Coleman didn't know. The man he had just accused was connected to the school in a way no one inside that building had ever imagined. 3 years before the accusation, Marcus Reed had learned how to become invisible, not literally. He simply learned how to move through a room without asking anyone to notice him. Every morning he arrived at Westbridge Academy at 5:42 a.m., 20 minutes before the first security officer began his shift. He parked his 12-year-old sedan behind the maintenance building, carried a thermos of coffee through the side entrance, and unlocked the small room where the school's tools were kept. By 6 o'clock, the hallways were already beginning to change. The building was old enough to make noises of its own. Pipes clicked behind the walls. Heating vents rattled when the temperature dropped. One particular door near the science wing refused to close properly, no matter how many times someone adjusted its hinges. Marcus had fixed that door 4 times. He knew the building better than most people who worked inside it. He knew which classroom window leaked after heavy rain. He knew which elevator made a strange sound before its inspection was due. He knew that the 3rd-floor boys' restroom had a faucet that needed to be turned slightly to the left, or it would drip all night. He also knew that most people never noticed any of this. That was fine with him. Marcus had not taken the job because he needed to prove anything. He had taken it because it gave him something he had not had for a long time: routine. And because it gave him something even more important: time with Sofia. At 7:15 every morning, Marcus would leave the maintenance room long enough to meet his daughter near the school's east entrance. Sofia Reed was 12 years old, academically gifted, and deeply embarrassed by the fact that her father knew exactly how many pieces of fruit she had eaten before school. He always carried an extra apple. She always insisted she didn't want it. And almost every morning he found it sitting untouched in the side pocket of her backpack by lunchtime. "You need to eat," Marcus would tell her. "I had breakfast." "Half a waffle isn't breakfast." It was a big waffle. Marcus would look at her. Sofia would look back. Then she would take the apple. Neither of them would mention the argument again. Those small moments mattered to Marcus more than most people understood. His wife, Elena, had been the person who once filled the house with those moments. She had laughed loudly. She had believed every problem could be solved with enough patience and a second cup of coffee. 5 years earlier, cancer had taken her from them. After Elena died, Marcus changed. Not dramatically, he didn't disappear. He didn't stop working. He simply stopped living loudly. Before Elena's illness, Marcus had owned a regional facilities management company. At its peak, the company employed more than 100 people and handled maintenance contracts for hospitals, office buildings, and private schools across the state. He had worn tailored suits then. He had spent nights in hotels. He had attended meetings where people stood when he entered the room. He had also missed too many dinners, too many school events, too many ordinary evenings with his wife. After Elena died, the business no longer felt like success. It felt like a place where he had spent years trading pieces of his life for numbers on a balance sheet. So Marcus sold it. He kept enough money to secure Sofia's future, paid what he owed, and quietly established a charitable foundation. Then he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He stepped away, no speeches, no interviews, no newspaper photographs. He simply chose a smaller life at Westbridge Academy. That meant a work jacket instead of a suit, a toolbox instead of a briefcase, a quiet apartment instead of a large house. And, most importantly, evenings with his daughter. Sofia knew her father had once owned a successful company. She knew he had sold it. She knew they were financially comfortable. But she didn't know how comfortable. Marcus had never wanted money to become part of her identity. Sofia had earned her place at Westbridge through academic achievement. Her scholarship covered most of her tuition. Marcus wanted her teachers to see her as Sofia, not as someone's daughter, not as a donor's child, not as a girl whose family could buy influence. So when people at the school asked what Marcus did before becoming part of the maintenance staff, he usually gave them the simplest answer: facilities work. He never corrected anyone who assumed that was all he had ever done. There was one habit, however, that sometimes betrayed the life he had left behind. Whenever a contractor handed him a document, Marcus read it carefully, not casually, carefully. He noticed numbers, dates, company names, payment terms. He could look at a page for 30 seconds and recognize when something didn't belong. One morning in October, a contractor left a stack of renovation invoices on the maintenance counter. Marcus was supposed to file them. He glanced at the first page, then the second. On the third, he stopped. The invoice was for electrical work in the new science wing. The amount was higher than he expected. Marcus studied it for another moment. Then he placed the document back on the stack. He didn't say anything. At the time, it seemed like a small thing. It wasn't, because Westbridge Academy was in the middle of a $4.6 million renovation project. And somewhere inside those numbers, someone had already begun hiding something. Marcus just didn't know yet that the missing money would soon be placed at his feet. By November, Westbridge Academy was beginning to look less like a school and more like a private university. New stone walkways connected the older buildings. The science wing had been stripped down to its concrete frame. Workers moved through the campus, carrying equipment worth more than Marcus had earned in some years of his previous life. The renovation had been announced as one of the school's most ambitious projects in decades. $4.6 million, new laboratories, a renovated gymnasium, updated electrical systems, a redesigned library. The board called it an investment in the school's future. Marcus mostly called it another building that needed to be maintained. He noticed things other people didn't. One afternoon, he watched a contractor unload 6 identical industrial light fixtures. Marcus checked the delivery sheet. The invoice listed 8. He counted the boxes again. 6. He mentioned it to the site supervisor. The man barely looked up from his phone. "They'll send the other two tomorrow." Marcus nodded. He didn't argue. The next morning, 2 more fixtures arrived. He forgot about it, or thought he did. A week later, Marcus was repairing a damaged wall near the administration offices when Principal Richard Coleman walked past. Coleman was the kind of man who rarely rushed. His suits were always perfectly pressed. His shoes never seemed to collect dust. He had been principal of Westbridge for 8 years, and he had built a reputation for turning the school into one of the most respected private institutions in the region. Parents trusted him. Board members listened to him. Donors knew his name. Students knew better than to interrupt him in the hallway. Marcus knew him mostly as the man who sometimes walked past a wet floor without seeing the caution sign. "Mr. Reed," Coleman said one morning. Marcus looked up. "The board tour is tomorrow. Make sure the East Corridor looks presentable." "It will," Coleman continued walking. Marcus returned to the wall. No insult, no argument, just another reminder of where Marcus existed in Coleman's mental map of the school: useful, necessary, and invisible. The second moment happened with Sofia. She had been selected for an academic competition, and Marcus had spent 2 evenings helping her prepare. On the morning of the competition, Sofia stood near the administration entrance holding a presentation board. Marcus walked over. "You have everything?" "Yes." "Water?" "Yes." "Backup pen?" She sighed. "Yes, Dad." He smiled. Then Coleman approached with 2 board members. Sofia immediately straightened. Coleman looked at her presentation board. "You're one of the scholarship students, correct?" Sofia nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good. Make the school proud." Then he turned to the board members and continued talking. He didn't ask her name. Marcus noticed. Sofia noticed too, but she said nothing. That afternoon, she came second in the competition. Marcus was waiting outside the auditorium. He had left a maintenance call unfinished just to be there. When Sofia walked out, she was trying not to smile. Marcus held up 2 fingers. "Second place?" She nodded. "By how much?" 2 points. Marcus smiled. "Then next time, beat her by 3. Sofia laughed. For a few seconds, neither of them cared about the school, the renovation, or the people who had never learned their names. But the third moment was different. It happened inside the maintenance office. Marcus was filing renovation documents when he noticed the same contractor's name again: Harrington Development Services. The invoice was for electrical work, $74,000. Marcus looked at the description, then at the work that had actually been completed. He knew enough about construction to understand that the number didn't make sense. Not necessarily fraud. But something was wrong. He pulled another invoice from the stack, same company, different date. Another unusually high charge. Marcus sat back. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't even make a copy. He simply wrote the 2 invoice numbers on a small piece of paper and placed it inside his wallet. A habit from his old life. When something didn't make sense, remember it. That evening, Marcus picked up Sofia from the library. She climbed into the passenger seat. "How was your day?" "Normal." "That's usually not a good sign." She smiled. Then she looked out the window. "Dad?" "Yeah? Do you ever wish you still had your old company?" Marcus thought about it. Streetlights moved across his windshield. "Sometimes." "Why did you sell it?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Because I learned that being successful and having a good life aren't always the same thing." Sofia was quiet. She didn't know that her father's old company had sold for several $1,000,000. She didn't know that he still had lawyers who handled his investments. And she certainly didn't know that a charitable foundation bearing his family's name had quietly contributed millions of dollars to the very school where he now repaired broken doors. She only knew that her father liked quiet evenings. And Marcus intended to keep it that way. At least, he thought he could. Then, 3 days later, the school's chief financial officer walked into Principal Coleman's office carrying a report. He closed the door behind him and placed one number on the desk, $180,000. It was missing from the renovation fund. And for the first time, Marcus Reed's quiet existence was about to become a problem. At 8:10 the following morning, Principal Richard Coleman closed the door to his office and asked Marcus Reed to sit down. Marcus knew immediately that something was wrong. Coleman rarely asked him to sit. Usually, instructions came in the hallway: a broken lock, a leaking pipe, a room that needed to be opened before a parent meeting. This was different. Across from Coleman sat Daniel Brooks, the school's chief financial officer. A thick folder rested between them. Marcus looked at it. "What's this about?" Daniel opened the folder. "The renovation account." Marcus waited. Daniel turned several pages. $180,000 is unaccounted for. Marcus's expression didn't change. "Unaccounted for? That's correct." Coleman folded his hands. "The board reviewed the preliminary audit yesterday." Marcus looked from one man to the other. "And what does that have to do with me?" Coleman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed a printed access log across the desk. Marcus looked down. His name appeared several times. Maintenance office. After hours. The dates matched several of the disputed transactions. Marcus understood what they were doing. "You think I took it?" Coleman leaned back. "We're asking questions." "No." Marcus looked directly at him. "You're not asking questions." The room went quiet. Daniel shifted in his chair. Coleman studied Marcus for several seconds. Then he said, "You had access to the maintenance office. You handled renovation documents. You were here after hours on several of the dates in question. I was repairing the building. That doesn't explain the missing money." "No," Marcus said. "It doesn't." Coleman opened another document. "This invoice was accessed from your office at 6:43 p.m. on October 14. Marcus glanced at it. He recognized the invoice. Harrington Development Services. "You know the company?" "I've seen their work." Coleman watched him carefully. "That's not what I asked." Marcus paused. "I know the company." That was enough. Coleman's expression changed slightly. It was the first moment Marcus realized the conclusion had already been formed. The evidence didn't lead Coleman toward Marcus. Coleman had chosen Marcus first. Now he was collecting reasons. "Where were you that evening?" Coleman asked. "Here. After everyone else left?" "Yes. Why?" "The science wing door was damaged." Coleman nodded slowly. "Convenient." Marcus looked at him. "What's convenient about repairing a door?" Coleman didn't answer. Instead, he closed the folder. "I have no choice but to suspend you while the investigation continues." Marcus remained seated. "You can suspend me." Coleman looked surprised. "You understand?" "I understand that you're under pressure." That answer seemed to irritate him. "This isn't about pressure." Marcus stood. "It's about evidence." Before Coleman could respond, there was a knock on the door. One of the security officers entered. Marcus looked toward the hallway and saw Sofia. She was standing several feet away with her backpack over one shoulder. Her face changed when she saw the security officer. Then she looked at her father. Marcus's expression softened. "Sofia." She didn't move. Coleman stepped toward the doorway. "Sofia, You need to go to class." She ignored him. "Dad?" Marcus walked toward her. The security officer stepped aside. Sofia looked from him to Coleman. "What's happening?" Marcus glanced at the folder on Coleman's desk, then at his daughter. There were moments in a parent's life when a complicated explanation was worse than a simple truth. Marcus had no intention of explaining a financial investigation in a hallway full of students. He lowered his voice. "Go to class, but I'll explain everything tonight." Sofia stared at him. Her voice became smaller. "Did you do it?" The question hurt more than Coleman's accusation. Marcus took a breath. "No, sweetheart." Coleman looked away. Marcus turned toward the security officer. "I'll collect my things. You won't be allowed back into the maintenance area," the officer said. Marcus nodded. He didn't argue. He walked toward the side exit. As he passed the administration desk, he saw two teachers watching him. One looked away. The other whispered something. Marcus kept walking. Outside, the morning air was cold. Students were arriving through the main gate. A few of them recognized him. Some stared. One of them whispered the word "stole." Marcus heard it. He kept walking. At the parking lot, he stopped beside his car. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Not because he was afraid of losing his job. He could survive that. What disturbed him was something else. Someone had taken a set of financial records, moved money through the school's renovation accounts, and deliberately created a trail that pointed toward the maintenance office. And now his daughter had watched him being escorted out of the school she loved. Marcus opened his car door. Before getting inside, he looked back at the school. The science building stood behind the glass windows. The same building his foundation had helped pay for. The same building he had chosen to clean and repair, because he wanted Sofia to grow up believing that hard work mattered more than money. Marcus sat down behind the wheel. He started the engine. Then he made a decision. He wasn't going to fight Coleman. He wasn't going to defend himself with anger. He was going to find out exactly where the $180,000 had gone. And if someone had deliberately put his name beside it, Marcus intended to find out why. That evening, Marcus did not tell Sofia everything. She sat across from him at their kitchen table, her homework open but untouched. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sofia asked, "Are you going back?" Marcus looked at her. "I don't know." She lowered her eyes. "People were talking about you." "I know. They said you stole the money." Marcus reached across the table and closed her notebook. "Look at me." She did. "I didn't steal anything." Sofia nodded, but the uncertainty in her face remained. Marcus understood why. At 12, trust was not built from explanations. It was built from years of ordinary things. Packed lunches, late-night homework, a hand on your shoulder when you were afraid. And now, in one morning, someone had placed a question mark over all of it. Marcus stood and walked toward the living room. He opened a drawer in an old wooden cabinet and took out a small laptop. It was not the computer he used for everyday work. This one contained old business records. He had kept it after selling his company because some documents were easier to access there. Marcus logged into an archived accounting system. Then he searched for one name: Harrington Development Services. The company appeared in several old contracts. Marcus studied the screen. Harrington had once been a subcontractor for his former company. But there was something strange. The current company wasn't owned by the same people. Marcus opened the corporate registration. The current managing director was a man named Evan Mercer. Marcus recognized the name. Mercer had worked for his old company for 6 years. He had left shortly before Marcus sold it. Marcus leaned back. That did not prove anything, but it gave him a direction. He opened the renovation invoices again. The first suspicious payment was $74,000, then another $31,600, then $28,400, then several smaller payments. Together, they approached the missing $180,000. Marcus looked at the dates. They weren't random. Each payment had been approved shortly before a corresponding renovation milestone. Someone had been taking legitimate project expenses and increasing them. But that raised another question. Who had authorized the payments? Marcus found the approval signatures. The first belonged to the procurement department. The second belonged to a project manager. The third had been electronically approved through the principal's office. Marcus stopped. He stared at the screen. Coleman's name wasn't proof of involvement, but it meant Coleman had seen at least some of the numbers. Marcus wrote down the dates. Then his phone rang. It was a number he hadn't seen in years. Marcus, he recognized the voice, even Mercer. Marcus said nothing for a moment. How did you get this number? I called an old contact. Marcus looked at the laptop. You're working with Westbridge. There was a pause. Yes. Why? Another pause. Because they needed a contractor. Marcus's voice became colder. Did you know my daughter goes there? I didn't know she was your daughter until recently. Marcus sat down. Recently? Someone mentioned it. Who? Mercer didn't answer. Then he said, Marcus, you need to stay away from this. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Why? Because you don't understand what's happening. I understand that $180,000 is missing. Mercer exhaled. You should let the school handle it. The call ended. Marcus remained completely still. That conversation had changed the situation. Mercer hadn't said Marcus was innocent. He hadn't said he was guilty. He had simply warned him to stay away. Marcus opened the invoice records again. Then he noticed something he had missed earlier. The invoice numbers were sequential. Except one. There was a gap. Invoice 1847. Marcus searched the school's records. Nothing. He searched the archived contractor records. Still nothing. Then he remembered something from his old company. Whenever an invoice disappeared from a sequence, it usually meant one of two things. It had been canceled, or someone didn't want it found. Marcus picked up his phone. He called someone else. Not the school, not the police, not the board. A woman named Laura Bennett answered. Laura had been the general counsel of Marcus's former company. Marcus? Laura, I need a favor. What happened? I need you to look into a contractor. He gave her the name, then he gave her the invoice number. There was silence. Marcus. Laura said carefully, Why are you asking? Because someone is trying to make me look like a thief. Laura's tone changed immediately. Send me everything you have. Marcus looked toward the hallway. Sofia's bedroom door was closed. He lowered his voice. And Laura? Yes, don't use my foundation. Another pause. Are you sure? Not yet. He ended the call. Marcus opened the school renovation documents one more time. The numbers were beginning to form a pattern, but the pattern pointed somewhere he hadn't expected. The payments weren't simply being inflated. They were being routed through a second company. A company that had been created only 8 months earlier. And its registered address was not a contractor's office. It was a private mailbox in downtown Chicago. Marcus stared at the screen. Then he saw the name of the company director, Evan Mercer. For the first time that night, Marcus leaned back in his chair. The $180,000 was not an isolated mistake. Someone had built a system around it, and Marcus was beginning to suspect that the person who had put his name into the investigation knew exactly where to place the blame. But there was still one thing he couldn't explain. Why him? That answer would come from a document Marcus had not seen in 5 years. A document that connected his quiet life at Westbridge to a secret he had deliberately kept from everyone, including Sofia. Laura Bennett called Marcus the next morning. She didn't waste time with greetings. "I found invoice 1847. Marcus stood beside the kitchen window. "And?" "It was never canceled." Marcus waited. "It was transferred. To whom?" "Not a contractor." Laura paused. "To a property entity." Marcus frowned. "What property entity?" Laura gave him the name Westbridge Educational Properties, LLC. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that name. Not because he had seen it in the school's records, because he had created it. 5 years earlier, after Elena's death, Marcus had established the Reed Foundation. The foundation had quietly contributed $2.8 million to Westbridge Academy, helping fund the science wing, part of the gymnasium renovation, and the school's scholarship program. But there had been another part of the arrangement. The foundation's property division had purchased the land beneath the new science building. The school operated the building. The foundation retained ownership. Marcus had structured it that way to protect the property and the school's scholarship programs from future financial problems. Only a handful of lawyers knew the complete arrangement, and almost nobody at Westbridge knew that Marcus Reed was the person behind it. Laura continued. "There's more." Marcus said nothing. "The renovation agreement requires the school to notify the foundation trustee if there are material financial irregularities involving foundation property." Marcus looked toward the hallway. "And did they?" "No." His expression hardened. "Who requested the original agreement?" Laura hesitated. "Richard Coleman." Marcus was silent. "When?" "3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. That was before the accusation, before the security officers, before Sofia had watched her father walk out of the school. Marcus understood something now. Coleman had discovered part of the foundation structure. He might not have known Marcus was the trustee, but someone had been looking. Someone had found a connection. And shortly afterward, $180,000 disappeared. Marcus asked quietly, "Can you get me the original agreement?" "I already have it." A few seconds later, the document arrived. Marcus opened it. He scrolled to the final page. There it was. His signature, Marcus Reed, controlling trustee. He stared at the screen. For 5 years, he had kept that name away from Westbridge. Now he knew he could no longer keep 2 lives separate. And somewhere inside the school, someone had already begun connecting them. The question was no longer simply, who stole the $180? It was, who knew who Marcus Reed really was? And why did they need him to take the blame? The emergency board meeting began at 9 the following morning. Richard Coleman arrived early. For the first time since the investigation began, he looked uncertain. The board members sat around the long oak table while Daniel Brooks, the school's chief financial officer, placed the latest audit documents in front of them. The preliminary $180,000 discrepancy had grown into something much larger. Nearly $640,000 in renovation payments were now under review. Several invoices had been inflated. Some payments had been routed through companies with almost no operating history. And one of those companies was connected to Evan Mercer. Coleman looked at the documents. I wasn't aware of the full scope of this. The board chairman looked up. Then why did you accuse Marcus Reed? Coleman hesitated. I had evidence that pointed toward his access to the maintenance office. Access isn't proof. Coleman said nothing. The conference room doors opened. Laura Bennett entered carrying a leather folder. Behind her was another attorney representing the Reed Foundation. The chairman stood. Can we help you? Laura placed the folder on the table. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm counsel for the Reed Foundation. Coleman's expression changed. The foundation? Laura nodded. We understand that Westbridge Academy has experienced financial irregularities involving property owned by the foundation. The chairman frowned. We're handling an internal investigation. Laura looked directly at him. That is no longer sufficient. She opened the folder. Under the foundation agreement, the trustee must be notified of any material financial irregularity involving foundation property. The chairman looked around the table. Who is the trustee? Laura didn't answer immediately. Then she looked toward the doorway. Marcus Reed was standing there. He wasn't wearing his work jacket. He wasn't carrying his toolbox. For the first time in years, he was wearing a dark suit. Laura said, Mr. Marcus Reed. No one spoke. Coleman stared at him. The chairman looked from Marcus to Laura. You're saying Mr. Reed is the trustee? The controlling trustee. Laura replied. A board member slowly lowered the papers in his hands. Coleman looked at Marcus as if he were seeing him for the first time. The foundation's contributions, he began. Marcus nodded.
Approximately $2.8 million.
The room became completely silent. Coleman looked down at the documents in front of him, then back at Marcus. The science building, the foundation helped fund it. The scholarship program? Yes. Coleman's face tightened. The man he had accused of stealing from the school was connected to the foundation that had helped build it. But Marcus didn't smile. He didn't remind Coleman what he had done. He didn't ask for an apology. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down. Then he looked at the board chairman. Let's talk about where the money went. The forensic audit began that afternoon. Marcus deliberately kept himself out of the investigation. He didn't want the process to become personal. Independent auditors examined every renovation payment, every approval, every contractor agreement, and every electronic authorization. 6 days later, they presented their findings. The $180. 00 wasn't one missing payment. It was part of a larger pattern. Harrington Development Services had submitted inflated invoices. Several of those invoices had been approved despite obvious discrepancies. Payments had then moved through another company controlled by Evan Mercer. Some of the money had eventually been transferred into private accounts. But the investigation also uncovered something else. Richard Coleman had not created the scheme. He had not personally taken the money, but he had ignored warning signs. He had approved questionable expenses. And when the board demanded an immediate explanation, he had chosen the easiest person to blame, Marcus, the employee with the least institutional power, the man nobody expected to challenge the accusation. The board chairman turned toward Coleman. Why did you make Mr. Reed the primary suspect before the audit was complete? Coleman stared at the table. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he finally looked at Marcus. I thought I knew who he was. Marcus remained silent. Coleman continued. I saw his position. I saw his access. I saw the circumstances. And I made a decision before I had all the facts. His voice became quieter. I was wrong. The room remained silent. Marcus finally spoke. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. Coleman looked at him. "The problem was that you decided who I was before you knew anything about me." Coleman lowered his eyes. The board accepted his resignation that afternoon. Even Mercer was removed from the renovation project, and the evidence concerning the fraudulent invoices was turned over to the appropriate authorities. The school terminated its contracts with the companies involved, but Marcus wasn't finished. He requested structural changes, independent approval for major renovation contracts, mandatory conflict of interest disclosures, quarterly external financial audits, dual authorization for payments above $25,000, and a formal policy preventing employees from being publicly accused before an investigation had established the facts. The board approved every measure. One board member then asked Marcus whether he would consider joining the school's governing board. Marcus shook his head. No. The man looked surprised. "Why not?" Marcus glanced toward the windows. "Because I didn't come here for a position." He stood. "I came here because the truth needed to be found." And that was all he said. The investigation had cleared his name, but more importantly, it had forced the institution to confront something far more uncomfortable than a missing $180,000. It had forced them to confront how easily they had judged a man simply because of the job he performed. Marcus had spent years being invisible. Now everyone knew his name. He still didn't want them to. The school did not return to normal overnight. For several weeks, Westbridge Academy remained under scrutiny. Bont Kearns asked questions. The renovation was delayed. Several contractors were removed from the project. The board hired an independent financial controller and introduced procedures that had never existed before. For the first time, every major payment required more than one person to approve it. The changes were practical. They were necessary. But for Marcus, the most difficult part was not the investigation. It was returning to the school. On his first morning back, he parked in the same space behind the maintenance building. He took the same toolbox from his trunk. He walked through the same side entrance. Nothing about the hallway had changed, except the way people looked at him. A teacher stopped him near the science wing. "Mr. Reed." Marcus turned. She hesitated. "I owe you an apology." Marcus waited. "I believed what I heard." She looked embarrassed. "I should have waited for the facts." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." Then he continued walking. He didn't need a longer conversation. Another teacher apologized later that afternoon. Then another. Marcus accepted each one quietly. He didn't hold a grudge, but he didn't pretend the experience hadn't happened either. He understood something now. People could change their opinion of you in a single afternoon. Sometimes it took years to earn someone's respect. Sometimes it took one accusation to lose it. And sometimes the truth had to become impossible to ignore before people were willing to see it. The person Marcus hadn't seen since the investigation was Richard Coleman. His office had been emptied. The nameplate had been removed from the door. There was a small rectangle on the wall where the paint had remained darker around it. Marcus stood there for a moment. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel angry. Mostly, he felt tired. Coleman had made a terrible decision. But Marcus knew that one bad decision didn't explain an entire human being. What mattered now was what the school did with the lesson, and Westbridge had begun changing. The financial controls were stronger. Employees were being trained to report irregularities without fear. Contractors were being reviewed more carefully. And the board had created a new scholarship fund in Elena Reed's name. Marcus hadn't asked for it. The board had suggested it. He accepted. Not because he wanted his wife's name attached to the school, because Elena had always believed that education should be an opportunity, not a privilege reserved for families who could afford it. There was one person who still had questions: Sofia. That evening, Marcus found her sitting on the sofa at home. Her school bag was on the floor. Her homework was open. She wasn't doing it. Marcus sat beside her. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus knew exactly what she meant. He looked at his daughter. "About the foundation?" She nodded. "And the money. And the school." Marcus leaned back. "Because I wanted you to have something that belonged entirely to you." Sofia frowned. "What? Your name?" She looked confused. Marcus continued. "You earned your place here. Your grades earned it. Your work earned it. I didn't want anyone saying you were there because of me. But you could have told me. I could have. Then why didn't you?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Because you were 12. Sofia rolled her eyes. "That's not an answer. It is when you're a father." She tried not to smile. She failed. Then she became serious again. "I was scared when they took you out." Marcus looked down. "I know. I thought everyone believed you. Some people did." "Did you?" Marcus looked at her. "I always knew who I was." Sofia was quiet. Then she leaned against his shoulder. After a moment, she asked, "So, are we rich?" Marcus laughed. "We're comfortable." "That's not what I asked." He smiled. "Then yes." Sofia stared at him. "How rich?" Marcus shook his head. "That's enough questions for one night." She laughed. For the first time since the accusation, the tension between them disappeared. The next morning, Marcus returned to work. He could have left. He could have hired someone else to manage the foundation. He could have bought another house, sent Sofia to another school, and walked away from Westbridge forever. He didn't. He returned to the maintenance department. He still arrived before sunrise. He still checked the heating system. He still repaired broken doors. And, strangely enough, that was the part that mattered most, because Marcus had never needed to become someone else after the truth was revealed. He had simply needed the world to finally understand who he had been all along. One morning, Sofia passed him near the science wing. She stopped. "You know they could hire someone else to fix that door." Marcus tightened a screw. "They could." "Then why are you still doing it?" Marcus looked at the door, then at his daughter. "Because it needs fixing." Sofia smiled. "That's such a dad answer." She walked toward class. Marcus watched her disappear around the corner. Then he turned back to the door. The school was quiet again, and for Marcus Reed, that was enough. People often mistake visibility for value. They assume the person wearing the expensive suit matters more than the person carrying the toolbox. They assume authority belongs to the loudest voice in the room. And sometimes, the quietest person is carrying the greatest responsibility. Marcus Reed did not become valuable when the board discovered his name. He was valuable before they knew it. He did not need revenge. He needed the truth to be examined carefully. And when the truth finally surfaced, it did more than clear his name. It forced an institution to examine the way it judged people. Sofia learned something from that experience too. Her father's greatest lesson wasn't that he had money. It was that he never needed money to prove his worth, because dignity doesn't come from what people discover about you. It comes from who you remain when they don't know anything about you. Marcus could have used his wealth to embarrass the people who had humiliated him. Instead, he used his position to make the system better for the people who had less power than he did. That was the difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge would have ended with one man losing. Accountability left the school stronger than it had been before. And perhaps that was the real reason Marcus had stayed quiet for so long. He never wanted Sofia to believe that her father's money was what made her important. He wanted her to understand something much harder. That character matters when nobody is watching. That dignity matters when nobody applauds. And that your worth does not become greater simply because other people finally recognize it. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who has nothing to prove. If this story reminded you that true dignity doesn't require recognition, subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this.